What would you do if the woman who called you barren for years was the first person you had to tell about your pregnancy? This is the twisted reality Zoe faced her mother in. Law's cruelest taunt, now a lie. Her revenge complete, without ever raising her voice. Before we begin with this interesting story, where are you watching from? Type your location in the comments section. Let's see how far this story reaches. Once upon a time, there lived a happy couple in a beautiful city. Their names were Zoe and Ryan, and for the first 2 years of their marriage, they lived happily alone in their lovely home. Zoe was a tech expert who worked remotely, while Ryan owned several successful businesses in town. Despite his busy schedule, Ryan always made time for his wife. She was his happy place, and he never missed an opportunity to show it. They shared laughter, prayers, and even their dreams. The only thing missing in their marriage was a child. Though the couple had agreed to enjoy each other first, Margaret had other plans. She was a traditional woman who couldn't understand why her daughter-in-law still hadn't had a child after 3 years of marriage. By her 3rd year of marriage, Margaret had already had 2 children. She believed a woman's duty was to bear children, raise them, and keep her husband happy. Margaret decided it was time to get to the bottom of the issue, so she packed her bags and headed straight for the city. She arrived at their home unannounced, dragging her large suitcase behind her as Zoe rushed to give her a hug. "Mom, you're welcome. We didn't know you were coming," Zoe said to her mother-in-law, who scolded her for implying she needed permission to visit her own son. "How dare you?" Mrs. Margaret snapped, pushing Zoe away. "Stay away from me!" Zoe remained respectful, forcing a smile as she greeted her warmly. "Welcome, Mom. You look well. Let me get you something to eat," she said before heading to the kitchen to prepare a meal. Mrs. Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she marched into the living room, her sharp eyes scanning the immaculate space. Then her gaze locked onto the dining table in Zoe's workstation. 2 laptops, a phone, a tablet, and a tangle of wires and chargers were plugged into the outlets. Mrs. Margaret's face twisted in anger. "So this is why this worthless girl refuses to give my son a child," she hissed. In one swift motion, she snatched the electronics and stormed into the bathroom, dunking them into the filled tub. When Zoe returned minutes later, her devices were gone. "Mom, where are my?" Mrs. Margaret ignored her, smirking as Zoe frantically searched. Finally, Zoe froze in the bathroom doorway, her stomach dropping. There, floating in soapy water, were the ruined remains of her MacBook, tablet, and phone, her entire livelihood destroyed. Zoe rushed back to the living room, trembling with rage.
"Mom, what have you done?"
Mrs. Margaret stood with her arms crossed, chin raised. "Maybe now your womb will finally open and give my son children. Did you think babies come from laptops and phones?" Zoe's blood boiled. For years, she had been nothing but patient and kind to her mother-in-law, but this was too much. Zoe had endured her mother-in-law's snide comments and endless insults, believing that Mrs. Margaret would one day warm up to her and love her like a daughter. But standing there, staring at her ruined gadgets floating in the bathtub, she finally saw the truth. Mrs. Margaret hated her with a passion. And in that moment, something inside Zoe changed. She wiped her tears, took a deep breath, and composed herself. "Thank you, Mom," she said with chilling calmness. "You've shown me exactly who you are." Then she served Mrs. Thompson her meal without another word and locked herself in her room. Hours later, Ryan returned from work, shocked to find his mother lounging in the living room, clipping her nails. "Oh, Mom, you're here. I hope you're doing well," he said cautiously. Mrs. Margaret scoffed. "You married a useless woman. Instead of giving us grandchildren, she wastes her time glued to her laptop." She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "I'm not leaving this house until your wife is pregnant. Let's see how she avoids it under my watch." Ryan frowned. "Mom, please stay out of our marriage. When we're ready for children, we'll have them." Mrs. Margaret sneered. "Oh, so now my son is bewitched? That witch you call a wife thinks she's won, huh?" She leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Listen to me. If she's not pregnant in the next 3 months, I'll find you a real woman who can give you children before you grow old." Ryan had finally had enough. His mother's cruel rant crossed every line. Ryan gently urged his mother to go rest, then headed to the bedroom where his wife, Zoe, sat on the bed, carefully drying her ruined electronics. Her face was etched with sadness. Ryan had never seen her so broken. "What happened?" he asked softly. Zoe forced a weak smile. "I accidentally spilled water on them. The gadgets were completely dead, and Ryan's heart ached seeing his wife so devastated. "Don't worry, I'll replace everything," he promised, pulling her into a hug. Zoe looked up, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you." But she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. She refused to be the reason his mother was sent away. The next morning, Zoe woke up early to make breakfast only to find Mrs. Margaret already in the kitchen, setting the dining table with a lavish spread. Her mother-in-law flashed a smug grin. "Did you really think you could ever cook a meal this good?" Zoe clenched her fists, her anger simmering. She had tolerated enough of this woman's cruelty. It was time to fight back. As Mrs. Margaret strutted off to call Ryan for breakfast, Zoe stood frozen, her mind racing. This ends today. Zoe quickly dashed to the kitchen and grabbed a fistful of salt. She poured it into the steaming food before slipping back to her spot, waiting for the fireworks. Moments later, her husband Ryan entered the dining room with his beaming mother hovering beside him. Ryan looked pleasantly surprised. "Mom made breakfast?" he said, taking a seat eagerly. He took one big bite and immediately spat it back onto his plate. Mrs. Margaret's face twisted in confusion. She snatched the spoon and tasted it herself, barely stopping herself from gagging. "What in the— Who ruined my food with all this salt?" she shrieked. Right on cue, Zoe emerged from the kitchen holding a fresh plate. "Thank goodness I made a backup," she said sweetly, serving Ryan while flashing his mother an innocent look of shock. "How did your food get so salty, Mom?" "You conniving little witch," Mrs. Margaret exploded, jabbing a finger at Zoe. "You did this." Zoe's eyes instantly welled up with perfect practiced tears. She knew Ryan couldn't stand seeing her cry. "Why would I do that?" she sniffled, voice trembling. Unless someone wanted to make you doubt me." She let the implication hang, watching as Ryan's expression darkened toward his mother. The game was on. Ryan, knowing his mother's temperament, immediately believed his wife. He pulled Zoe into his arms, gently wiping her tears. "Mom, please," he said sternly, turning to his mother. "Stop this. Why would you accuse Lily of something like this?" Mrs. Margaret's mouth fell open in shock. "You're taking her side over mine?" "Yes, Mom," Ryan replied firmly. "Because ever since you arrived, there's been nothing but tension. You've insulted her, disrespected her, and all Zoe has done is show you kindness." Zoe sniffled, looking up at him with watery eyes. "I've tried, Ryan. I really have. I never wanted to come between you and your mother. But she doesn't want peace." "Exactly," Mrs. Margaret snapped. "Because you've bewitched my son, turned him into some spineless fool who can't see the truth." "Mom, that's enough," Ryan cut in, his voice sharp. "This is my house. Zoe is not your punching bag. If you can't respect her, you'll have to leave." Mrs. Margaret was stunned. She had underestimated Zoe badly. And Zoe? She was just getting started. Sweet and composed around Ryan, she became silently ruthless with her mother-in-law. Every move was calculated to make Mrs. Margaret look unhinged. One morning, Zoe went to the market and bought the exact same wrapper her mother-in-law kept in her suitcase. When she returned, she deliberately took scissors and began cutting it up. Mrs. Margaret froze mid-step. "Is that my wrapper?" she shrieked, storming toward Zoe. Slap. The blow sent Zoe stumbling back, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. She dropped the scissors with a dramatic gasp, eyes wide with feigned shock. The trap had been sprung. The sharp crack of the slap reverberated through the house. Ryan entered the living room just in time to see Zoe clutching her reddened cheek, tears streaming down her face. "What the hell is going on here?" Ryan roared, rushing forward. Zoe dissolved into hysterical sobs. "She hit me," she wailed, pointing at Mrs. Margaret. The older woman stood defiant, her face twisted in rage. "This lying witch destroyed my favorite fabric," Mrs. Margaret spat. "Tore it to shreds right in front of me." "But Mom," Zoe whimpered, "this isn't your fabric." Her voice trembled with feigned innocence. Ryan's jaw clenched. He stormed to his mother's room and flung open her antique cedar chest. There, perfectly folded beneath her sachets, lay the disputed fabric, completely intact. Returning with the evidence, Ryan's voice turned dangerously quiet. "Explain this, Mother." He held up the undamaged fabric. "You swore Sophia destroyed yours, yet here it is." Mrs. Margaret's haughty demeanor faltered. "I doubt it must have been a mistake," she stammered. "The pattern was identical. Why else would she be cutting?" "Because it was my mother's," Zoe interrupted with a heart-wrenching sob. She produced a tattered photograph showing her late mother wearing a dress made from the same material. "I was making memorial keepsakes. Would I really buy matching fabric just to torment you?" Ryan's expression darkened as Zoe continued. "All I've ever wanted was your love, Mrs. Margaret. But you've hated me from day one. I would never disrespect your belongings." The room fell silent, except for Zoe's quiet, weeping. Mrs. Margaret stood exposed, her web of lies unraveling before her son's disbelieving eyes. Ryan wrapped his arms protectively around his wife, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Mother, I think it's time you left." Ryan gently helped his wife Zoe to her feet, keeping a protective arm around her as he faced his mother. "Please, Mom," he pleaded, his voice strained. "Just stop this. Zoe has shown you nothing but kindness since you arrived, and you repay her with slaps and insults, all because you blame her for our decision to wait for children." Mrs. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Ryan cut her off. "Number, I love you, but if you can't respect my wife, you're turning our home into a battlefield, and I won't allow it." His voice hardened. "This is your last warning. Next time, I'll personally take you back to the village." His mother stood frozen, shock etching deep lines into her face. For the first time, Mrs. Margaret realized the terrifying truth. Zoe was dismantling her piece by piece without ever raising her voice, without leaving a single trace, and it was working. Her own son, the boy she'd raised with her own hands, now stood as a shield for this woman, his loyalty unshakable. And what could she say? Zoe's tears had buried her accusations 6 feet deep. The next morning, Zoe sat at the dining table, typing on her new laptop replacement Ryan had bought after the accident. The soft click of keys filled the room until a shadow fell across the screen. "I see you, Zoe." Mrs. Margaret's voice was a low, venomous hiss as she stepped closer, her knuckles whitening around the edge of the table. "You think you've won?" Zoe's fingers stilled. She didn't look up. Mrs. Margaret leaned in, her voice a razor-sharp whisper. "You think I don't see your game?" She shot a nervous glance down the hallway. "My son will wake up to your tricks. I'll make sure of it." Zoe's fingers paused on her keyboard. When she looked up, her sweet smile didn't reach her cold eyes. "Mrs. Margaret, I truly don't understand." "Enough." The older woman slammed her palm on the table, rattling the coffee cup. "You've turned my son against me in the very home I helped him buy. Enjoy your victory now, little snake. I will." Zoe closed her laptop with deliberate calm. In one fluid motion, she stood and closed the distance between them, her lips brushing Mrs. Margaret's ear as she whispered, "Better hurry then. Every time you fight me." Her breath was warm, her words poison wrapped in silk. "I look more innocent. And every time I win, you lose him a little more." Mrs. Margaret recoiled, as if struck just as Olivia's face crumpled into perfect distress. "Please stop yelling at me," she sobbed, stumbling backward with theatrical grace, tears materializing on command. Ryan came running, his tie still loose from dressing. "Mom, not again." "Ask her," Mrs. Margaret shrieked, finger quivering. "Ask your precious viper what she just—" Zoe collapsed to her knees, a masterpiece of vulnerability. "I was just working," she said. "I ruined her life. I only ever wanted her love." Her shoulders shook with manufactured grief as Ryan gathered her close. The final blow came as Ryan glared at his mother over Zoe's trembling head, his voice glacial. "Mom, we're done here. You need to leave tomorrow morning," Ryan said, his voice steel. "I'm done watching you torture my wife. I'm your son. Yes, but I'm her husband first." "No, Ryan, you can't do this." Mrs. Margaret's hands shook with fury, her voice cracking. "That's scheming." "You came here looking for war," Ryan interrupted, "and you've done nothing but tear my family apart. I love you, Mom, but if you can't respect my wife, you don't belong in this house." His mother stood paralyzed, her own child, choosing that woman over her. The betrayal carved itself across her face, but Mrs. Margaret wasn't defeated yet. That night, she lay awake, her mind racing. If my son wants proof, then proof he'll get. Zoe sat at the dining table, sipping orange juice, her laptop open. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret," she chirped. "Can I make you breakfast?" The older woman forced a thin smile. "Plantains and eggs, dear." The moment Zoe disappeared into the kitchen, Mrs. Margaret moved. Snatching the water pitcher, she poured a glistening trail across the hardwood floor, a perfect slick between the kitchen doorway and the dining area. "Let's see how innocent you look when you fall in front of my son," she thought, retreating to the living room just as Ryan's footsteps sounded upstairs. Mrs. Margaret perched stiffly on the living room sofa, her fingers clenched around her teacup. "This is it," she thought. She didn't need to utter a word, just let Zoe's true colors reveal themselves. One fall, one outburst, and Daniel would finally see the manipulative witch she truly was. Zoe emerged from the kitchen, balancing a tray of golden plantains and scrambled eggs, humming softly. She never saw the glistening puddle ahead. Her foot hit the water. Time seemed to freeze as the tray catapulted into the air. Plates shattered against the wall, food splattering like paint. Zoe's head snapped back as she hit the hardwood with a sickening thud, her body limp. Ryan came sprinting at the sound, skidding to his knees beside his unconscious wife. He whipped his head toward his mother, his voice raw. "What did you do?" Mrs. Margaret opened her mouth, but no excuse came. She watched, numb, as Ryan scooped Zoe into his arms and bolted for the car. By the time the garage door roared shut, Mrs. Margaret was already stuffing her suitcase. Her hands trembled as she zipped it closed. She'd gambled everything and lost. A single tear streaked her powdered cheek as she called a taxi. The house she'd helped her son buy now felt like a tomb. At the hospital, Ryan paced the sterile hallway, his mind replaying the betrayal. The doctor's voice snapped him from his thoughts. "Mrs. Margaret?" Ryan braced for the worst. "Your wife is going to be fine. And congratulations." The doctor smiled. "She's about 6 weeks pregnant." Ryan's knees nearly buckled. "Pregnant?" "The baby's heartbeat is strong. Just keep her off her feet for a few days." As the doctor walked away, Ryan slumped into a chair, laughing through tears. Joy and guilt warred in his chest. His mother had left on the day he'd have given anything to tell her she'd be a grandmother. Ryan stood frozen in the hospital room's fluorescent glow, his hands trembling as the reality settled over him. After all these years of waiting, of whispered arguments and his mother's cruel taunts, a child, the very miracle his mother had used as a weapon, now grew quietly in the woman she tried to destroy. He sank into the chair beside Zoe's bed, cradling her pale hand with reverent tenderness. "Sweetheart," he whispered, his voice cracking, "you're carrying our baby." A single tear traced down Zoe's cheek as the words washed over her. In that moment, even her carefully constructed composure faltered. "Call your mother," she murmured, her fingers tightening around his. She should know. Mrs. Margaret stood trembling in the parking lot, her suitcase abandoned at her feet when her phone rang. "Mom, Zoe's 6 weeks pregnant." The world seemed to tilt. Truly? Her voice broke, the word barely audible. Yes. While you were tormenting her, she was carrying your grandchild. Ryan's voice turned to steel. We need space, Mom. Be gone before we return home. I can't risk you near my family now. The line went dead, leaving Mrs. Margaret clutching the phone like a lifeline. The taxi driver called to her, but she didn't hear. The weight of her actions crashed down. Every cruel word, every scheme, every accusation. She'd been so certain Zoe was the villain, but the reflection in the car window showed only a bitter old woman who'd waged war against her own happiness. Zoe had won without ever raising her voice. The grandchild she demanded now bound her son to his wife more powerfully than any argument ever could. And as the taxi pulled away from the hospital, Mrs. Margaret realized with devastating clarity, the battle was over, and she'd lost everything. The bus ride back to the village stretched endlessly before Mrs. Margaret, each mile amplifying the hollowness in her chest. She stared blankly at her wrinkled hands, the same hands that had struck Zoe, that had poured water on the floor, that had pushed away the very blessing she'd claimed to want. A sob caught in her throat. All those years praying for a grandchild, and the woman I called barren, was already carrying my flesh and blood while I tormented her. The irony was cruel. She'd been so blinded by tradition and pride that she'd missed every chance to be part of this joy from the beginning. As the bus rattled past familiar fields, the truth settled like a stone. She'd become the villain in her own story. Some bonds are sacred. A marriage, like a seedling, needs patience and light not the crushing weight of interference. Mrs. Margaret had wielded her desperation like a machete, hacking at the very roots of her son's happiness until there was nothing left but splinters. But life has its own timing. Zoe's pregnancy wasn't just a miraculite, it was a mirror. In trying to expose her daughter-in-law, Mrs. Margaret had only revealed her own bitterness. And now, as the village gates came into view, she faced the hardest truth of all. The greatest losses aren't caused by fate, but by our own hands.